On behalf of Festival co-directors Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to JLF's Brave New World. Those of you who missed our special curtain raiser weekend celebrating JLF London at the British Library, featuring Meera Nair, Peter Frankopan, Amish Tripathi, and Nobel laureate Venki Ramakrishnan, and our stellar list of speakers, you can view these on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Our official radio partner is Red FM Bajate Raho. Our session today on JLF's Brave New World is the governance of the unprepared. Homi K. Bhabha in conversation. At a time of a global pandemic and a century which has seen turmoil and progress in equal measure, the one feature that stands out is how unprepared the human race is for both man-made and natural calamities. Scholar and critical theorist Professor Homi K. Bhabha speaks about this pandemic and its consequences of being unprepared and dwells on the future as well as the importance of the common good versus the self. Homi K. Bhabha is the Anne F. Rothenberg Professor of the Humanities and the English and Comparative Literature departments at Harvard University. He's also the author of numerous works exploring post-colonial theory, cultural change and power, contemporary art, and cosmopolitanism, including Nation and Narration and the Location of Culture. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it in the comment section. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you could find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF, or in the event that we drop off, just hang in there and we'll be right back on Facebook. Ladies and gentlemen, Governance of the Unprepared with Homi K. Bhabha. Homi, welcome. Where exactly are you?
I'm in my study in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at home. The dog is barking. The beautiful flowers are all over the place and in the garden. And I'm still at home talking to you, Sanjoy, which is such a pleasure. It's not the Diggy Palace, but it's home.
Homi, would you have ever thought, looking back even 4 months ago, in your busy schedule with you rushing around across the world, that you would have a time that you would be at home for a stretch like this for 8 weeks, even while I know that you have a personal commitment to get to Bombay at the very earliest? Would you have ever thought that? Were you prepared for it?
No, I was not prepared for it. But I'm Parsi enough to feel that I had a kind of a foreboding, Sanjoy, about infection. And I was never phobic about things like that. I travel too much. I'm in too many places. I eat out a lot. I have lots of friends. But the strange thing was that I had to do a Rolex event in Cape Town. Soon after in February, soon after I got back from India. And in between those two trips, I had about 8 days, and I became very concerned about flying and disinfecting my seat, disinfecting the toilet. I was never like that. I never gave it a thought. All I could think about was the lecture I was going to give. That's where my neurosis invested itself. But this time round, I don't think, maybe we'd heard a little bit about Wuhan by then, at the end of January. But it was not in my mind. But I was very, very concerned about the environment of the plane. But nothing like this. And of course, the eeriness of this whole situation is that the spring has been better than ever. The birds chirp, the flowers, are blooming, the ostriches in Bombay. And yet there is this sense of the poisoned air. And now, of course, the great irony that we thought that the United States would open up slowly, and we looked at it from the lens of entertainment and commerce and markets, public life, public health. But the United States has opened up with the horrific spectacle of Black death, public death, police deaths, and killings.
Homi, I'm going to come back to the Black Lives Matters in a bit, but Going back to the seminal work that you're presently engaged with, which is the nature of being unprepared, and what does that mean?
Yeah.
Tell me, for most governments, is when they're caught with their, well, for lack of a better word, their pants down, is the sort of excuse that we are unprepared? 1919, the Spanish flu, so many pandemics, so many issues, the SARS, etc. Can they actually take recourse or hide behind the fact that they were unprepared? And even now in India, Homi, as you know, we had a very stringent lockdown for 60 days where they were hoping to perhaps flatten the curve or perhaps delay the onset of the virus. And yet today we are seeing that cities are going to run out of hospital beds, as they did in New York. We may top uh, 550,000 in Delhi, 10 million in Bombay. So what is this? What is unprepared? Is it the lack of actually doing something? Is it excuse? Is it a sham?
Look, Sanjoy, it's all of these things. But let's start at the most basic, subjective human level. Life does treat us to unprepared moments. That is part of the contingency of life. That is part of the risks we take. So I want to acknowledge that there is a kind of sense of being unprepared, an ontological sense of being unprepared for every individual, which happens when, as you said to me, you're confronted by the pandemic and you never thought 5 months ago you would be spending all your days at home. So we are unprepared for certain things, and those moments need to be carefully analyzed, because I think being unprepared is different from what we usually talk about, which is risk assessment. Risk assessment, I want to say, assumes that there is a certain model and there is certain coordinates that you can deliberate on, and then you make a risk on the basis of what you know. But there is a kind of human way of being unprepared, which is what we call the act of God, say, where you really are unprepared. So I think we've got to accept that phenomenological, existential condition. We've got to understand it much more. And the main question is, how do you act when you are unprepared, in a situation of unpreparedness?
Homi, let me just stop you there for a second and go back to what you said about risk, about the risk assessment, and therefore it's different from being unprepared. If you look at the risk when America went to war in Iraq against the WMD, did they not know that that perhaps would lead to what we saw happening all the way across to the destabilization of the very region? When you look at the banking crisis that America went through, and there were enough indications that every bank had that they were junk, by and large, they were just offloading junk. That risk unpreparedness, perhaps, did they not take any? Did they not have a sense that this is what would happen because of it, or is it just about, okay, let's do something for the moment and let's forget about the consequences? Do we think the consequences through?
No, we don't. And it is not always possible to think the consequences through. One of the most touching and yet terrifying moments is in the new documentary on Hillary Clinton, where Bill Clinton is asked, how could you do this with Monica Lewinsky, then to lie? What did you think you were doing? And he said, I did it. I acknowledge I did it. I don't know how I did it. All I can say is, when there are so many pressures on you and you're going in so many directions, you do things for which you yourself are not prepared. Now, you can take it or you can leave it. But I want to say, to answer your three issues here, yes, there is a notion of being unprepared, and we've got to think about it, the psychic nature of it, the moral nature of it, the ethical nature of it, the political nature. Individuals unprepared, groups unprepared. Then there is what you talk about in terms of politics. Well, They thought they were prepared because they created, before walking into Iraq, they created the weapons of mass destruction on very, very weak grounds. You know, they knew that they were taking a risk, but they wanted to hedge that risk by going to the UN and saying there's a major issue here. We think there are weapons of mass destruction. So they took a risk, but they hedged it with the weapons of mass destruction. And then, of course, as Rumsfeld once said, shit happens. Well, shit happens because you make shit happen. But then once you start that process, shit does happen. So I think that you have to be very subtle and careful about this, that you do make a decision, you take a risk, and then things unfurl and unravel. Now, as far as the banking crisis goes, yes, everybody said we were unprepared. We were unprepared. Well, you are always unprepared for a perfect storm, but you may know that you are actually going into a storm. And there, of course, you had this idea of institutions that were too big to fail. We're too big to fail. If we will always be rescued. So I think these are different hedges. Now, I want to make this distinction. Individuals can generally be unprepared. Governments, particularly populist, authoritarian national governments, in our time, I believe, are creating a sense of unpreparedness because they want to be citizens to be unprepared, to be in a state of anxiety, unpreparedness, so that they can come in very decisively with often extra legal restrictions on public life and on citizens. So that these are not entirely illegal, but they're extra legal. You know, they play on that boundary. And this is what concerns me a great deal, because if citizens are continually being given media messages that through tweeting, that take falsehoods and turn them by the very nature of the medium itself, right? The public nature of the medium that takes falsehoods and makes them seem like facts. If that's only one element. Then there is the element of being given very short time in which to react. 4 hours or 6 hours before lockdown, you have to de-densify Bombay. These short spans of time very often are being used to create a vulnerability for one's freedoms and liberty as a citizenship. And that's where I use the term the unprepared citizens. Citizens are being kept in a place of unpreparedness. And by the way, if you saw the article in the New York Times a few days ago, the response to the coronavirus has been worst in authoritarian states and nations. Partly.
Homi, let's hold that thought for a second. And let's go back to, you were saying, some institutions are too big to fail. The British Empire failed. The banking system in America failed. Government after government failed. The Berlin Wall collapsed. Russia or the USSR fell apart. These were too big to fail. And the second aspect of this is like what you said. Many of these places used fear to be able to shore up what was perhaps already on very shaky grounds. You use fear and then you use authoritarian tactics to be saying, see what happens if I fail. I as a bank, I as a country, I as an institution. But history has shown that even when these institutions, countries, and so on and so forth fail, the human being is so resilient in their very nature of being that they get up, pick up their bags, pull up their socks, and they just march on.
That's correct. Well, first of all, the term too big to fail has to be read with irony and paradox. Right, nothing is too big to fail under certain circumstances. But very often when we say this, and when people feel governments, empires, industry, that we are too big to fail, That's the moment, I think, when they're on, that's the inflection point of danger. When they believe that, then they become unprepared for their own unraveling. So let me put that to you. Yes, I was just reading this morning, James Baldwin, who says real human resilience occurs when the black man has his foot clamped to the ground by the oppressor, the racist oppressor's foot, and he has to still look up from that position in the ground, if he is alive. In Minneapolis, Floyd died in a very similar scenario. He has to look up at his oppressor. He has to conquer the fear, and he has to always think about his next move or her next move in order to be able to rise in the way in which you said it. But the cost of that rising and the harms that happen in these authoritarian, too big to fail systems, which eventually fail, are considerable. I mean, look at the costs of the end of the Soviet Union, and now look at the cost of Russia, the Putin-esque Russia at this moment. Yes, empire crumbled and failed, but many post-colonial countries have had to pay hugely for their reconstruction. And indeed, many of them were then wrapped up into a world IMF or Washington consensus system, which did not enslave them, but which restricted their growth. So I think that one has to see that whole cycle. So that when organizations and nations think, or ideologies think, that they're too big to fail, I say that's the danger point, that's the inflection point. Over time, they probably will fail. But the survival instinct is strong. But the destruction and the pain of rising again should never be minimized. And I think climate change is also one of those long periods of time where we don't really suffer it so much, a little bit here, a little bit there, but we have to kind of have a memory for the future.
Homi, hold with the climate change. Let's come to that and say, let me go back to what you said earlier. The whole issue of fear. Is there a nexus today between big government or government and media in being able to always tweak fear to keep a sense of unpreparedness ready and handy to be able to take away personal rights? I mean, if the year before 9/11 happened, Homi, supposing somebody in America had told you and its citizens that, in 6 months' time, we're going to be recording every move, we're going to read your emails, we're going to listen in on your conversation, and we're going to film you 26 times every hour, would you all in America have agreed?
No, of course not. And many people did not even agree post 9/11, did not agree post 9/11 to civil liberties and civil rights being constrained. They're being contested in court. It was contested politically, contested in the media. So no, absolutely not. But you are right that in many practices of everyday life, you are gripped by fear in a state of unpreparedness and allow yourself to be half undressed every time you want to take an aeroplane. I mean, ask yourselves, did you ever think that you would be taking your belt off, taking your shoes off, taking your hat off, almost taking your mustache off to get onto a plane? So I am saying that good governance is about security, safety, and dignity and respect working together.
But Homi, whose security, whose safety, and whose dignity?
Well, I mean, I think, and that's not a difficult question. The security I'm talking about good governance. Good governance acknowledges the condition of unpreparedness, both individual and institutional, but balances in its determination, the security of individuals, the security of the state. This is no small matter. The security of individuals, the security of the state, and in considering the question of security, the dignity of individuals, which cannot be run roughshod over. Of course, there are extenuating circumstances. If you believe that there is a terrorist cell or that there is an attack, every state will want to respond. But the states that respond best are not the states that resort to torture. That's because under torture, people will confess to anything. The states that respond best are the states that understand the distinction between surveillance and safety. One of the issues that I tell you now is that we have a very surveillance state, say in the United States, but the streets are not safe for Black people. You see what I'm saying? You can surveil, but what you surveil does not actually protect the most vulnerable parts of our population.
But Homi, isn't that also because the crux of the problem in all of this, and I've seen reports saying the Minneapolis police is going to be disbanded or unfunded or whatever. But isn't the crux of the problem goes back to the whole fear factor, because you have such a rampant use of guns in the United States. So you have funded the police to ramp up their sort of sense of security when they go out to police the state. And as guns are increased and the kind of weaponry they're increased, the police also continues to have to ramp up their sort of use, etc. How is it that that in this case is not being looked at all, or it's not part of the debate? Is it not the fundamental crux of the insecurity that the Black person feels, or the person of minority feels on the streets of America, which is, if I do something, including dance in the middle of the street, I could well be shot?
Of course, that's absolutely right. And that is one of the whole issues to do with gun control, not only for the police, but gun control for ordinary people who have licenses, who should not be having guns, and so on. So that's a major issue here. Everything can get escalated in this way. But the more fundamental point about authoritarian governments that play with the civil liberties of their citizens does not need only an armed police force. Lathis can do the job just as well.
Don't give them encouragement. They've been doing a pretty good job here.
I know, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying they can be as much part of what you very nicely call the fear factor. And increases multiply in situations where there is a kind of governance through unpreparedness, through authoritarian procedures, through extra-legal or quasi-legal issues, through ways in which social life is controlled, through ways in which prejudice is encouraged, through ways in which there is a tacit agreement for violence against vulnerable people, religion manipulated. All these are parts of this cauldron of the unprepared, for which we now have to develop our own forms of resistance and agency. And it's actually very difficult, because anxiety and fear are parts of the phenomenology of human life. It is through fear and anxiety that we protect ourselves. What did Freud say? What is anxiety? Freud said anxiety is a signal. It reminds you of a past trauma. And because you're anxious, because you have fear, you can mitigate the next trauma. You see what I'm saying? So it's part of a way of living in a complex or dangerous world, whether you're a hunter-gatherer or whether you're a banker or a lawyer. It's a way of coping. But that is what gets exploited. You know, Sanjoy, my real problem here is that policy thinkers, or policy wonks as we call them, and politicians are so unintelligent at one level about the human political psyche of the citizen, and they're really ignorant about it. And when they begin to understand the affective nature of citizenship, fear, anxiety, ambivalence, they exploit it.
Well, they certainly have their wherewithal when it comes to getting elected. But Homi, let me ask you a question. Just going back in time, do you think the Egyptians got it right? I mean, from the moment they were born, they were preparing to die, and everything else sort of, went by the wayside. So they built their tombs and they created their caves in the Valley of the Kings, etc. And they prepared in a way for the afterlife. Is that the
Yes,
way?
that's a very fine question, Sanjoy. Of course, the issue is that when you prepare that carefully for the afterlife, you both fear death and you memorialize death, so that you actually build all these tombs. You immortality is what they were after. In the modern psyche, we don't think about immortality. At least most of us don't. We might think about rebirth or whatever. We don't think about immortality in that kind of legendary sense. But I do think that it is one of the great ironies of human life, almost universal, that the very point of birth has been statistically, particularly for the global south, the moment of death too. Every act of birth, when the child is emerging, is a moment of great fragility. Birth and death, natality and fatality, as philosophers say, come very, very close together. But I think that partly religious communities or faith-based communities do think in our secular world more about death, but they think about it in a certain theological way. I think in secular life, the notion of death is to be avoided. Everything that is of value is before the question of death. Here again, I come back to Baldwin, who's very much on my mind, and I'm writing about him at the moment. Baldwin says, it is only let's put it in very contemporary terms, that you can begin to construct the American dream. Baldwin is very well known for this phrase, we have to achieve our nation. The greatness of our nations are not given to us because of the past, because of the Vedas or because of the founding fathers. We have to every day achieve our nation's value. But there is another line in Baldwin, which has not been as commented on and which I'm trying to write about, which is his phrase, we've got to earn our debts. Every nation has to earn our debt. We have to understand what the effect of the genocide of Native Americans in this country, the endless violence against African Americans in this country, the violence against the Dalits, in order to understand what the good life might be. You have to think first about that social death, or not just death as a physical extinction of life. Death is not an extinction of life. Death is an extenuation of life. Death is a way in which you look back through a glass darkly to think about what the good life is, not only in relation to yourself, but in relation to the life of your neighbor.
So Homi, in all of this in America, and you talk about the good life and the life of your neighbor, you have a situation where this is something that has been very much part of America's society, which is discrimination, inequity. You in Washington, you cross the railway track a kilometer from Capitol Hill and you go into a completely different world. In New York, at least when you used to go to Harlem at one point in the 70s and 80s, it was a completely different world. America has known that it has to deal with this at some point of time. So forget the fact that the leaders or the political leaders or the political class has failed its citizens. What of the good and the great, the civil society, artists, artisans, how can they help in this scheme of creating perhaps or pushing back one on fear and pushing back on this sense of unpreparedness and saying these are concrete positive steps that we need to take to build society, to make it more equitable, to make it more just, and as you said, weigh up life and death of each and every person. And this is true, of course. I'm using America right now with the Black Lives Matter issue, but it's true for everything else. And yet, in most places, as we see today, Gone with the Wind, HBO removed Gone with the Wind. I mean, in tokenism, they removed Colton's statue yesterday in the UK. I mean, is tokenism going to then replace a much more thought through approach to what we need in our times?
So, Sanjoy, there are two issues here. I'll come to the tokenist issue, as you put it, in a minute. But I want to first take up the issue of the contribution of the arts and the contribution of the humanities. And let us not forget that America is a country where the liberal arts were very central to its educational process. Possibly not in many other countries where liberal arts, the humanistic core of thinking, seem to have to be taught urgently and imminently taught. Now, there are reasons why that might be weakening, but I think we've got to acknowledge that. Artists are generally not the legislators of the world. So they can work in the area of what I call...
Well, Bill Clinton did play the saxophone.
Yeah, well, but then, he played the saxophone. I think he was not a great saxophone player, and his talents may have been elsewhere. Let's not get into that for the moment. But what I am saying is that artists have limited power. They have the power of the imagination, the firing the imagination, but they cannot set the terms because economically, if you think about there are people who make millions from their work on the art market, but it is the market. That's only one aspect of what it means.
Is it also because they challenge the status quo?
So they can challenge the status quo in many ways, and they do challenge the status quo in many ways. So I could talk about this till sundown, till you get your next vodka. But let me return to something very immediate in this context, which has been very much on my mind. A work that was not supposed to be a work of art, it was supposed to be a political statement. I think it is actually a great work of site-specific installation art, and that is the big yellow letters, Black Lives Matter, on the main boulevard in Washington. I've been talking to two of my very close friends who are directors of two of America's largest and most influential museums over the last 2 days, Zoom meetings like this, telephone meetings, and saying to them, look, this is a very remarkable moment. A mayor put these letters on as a statement of political faith. Today, that is being referred to as a mural. Now, here you begin to see a public, political, secular ideal, Black Lives Matter, which refers to the history of America, it refers to citizenship, and the slogan, as it were, refers to the general condition of minority discrimination and minority violence and minority risk and minority fear. So it's out there in the open. And I say to my friends in the museum, look, this is a new way of thinking about installation art. When you see the Google pictures, it looks like some of the calligraphic art used after the Russian Revolution, the Russian revolutionary posters. It makes the letter into a figure. So I'm saying, now let us try and think about cultural citizenship and the function of art from this concrete instance of what happened. Now, interestingly, interestingly, to go back to the other issue you raised just now, which is, I forget what you called it, the gestural, or I forget the term you used.
Tokenism.
Tokenism, okay. So I think this is a great work, political as well as installation. It's art and language, which is a great aesthetic movement. So from what I gather, the Black Lives Matter Washington group are saying precisely this. This is a distraction. This is a mural. This is merely art. This money should be spent in more socially responsible ways. And the mayor is getting hit for what I think is a remarkable jeu d'esprit, a remarkable act of the imagination, given that in the public domain, people are not seeing it only as a political statement. They're saying it's a political statement, which is an ethical mural. I think it's a remarkable moment, but she's getting the shit for it. This makes me think of two things. How important it is to bring together humanistic, art, literary pedagogy and education, the kind of thing you're into at the JLF, with a political perspective, accepting that there will be conflicts, contradictions, paradoxes. That's the challenge we have to grasp at the moment. And then on the other hand, I think there is a whole view, as indeed these good people in Black Lives Matter Washington, that yes, this may be a very effective thing, but it's a distraction. It's only a token. Art is not a token. Literature is not a token. This is banal to keep repeating that, but the ways in which whole generations' minds have been changed through the cultural institutions and cultural industries, whether it's film, whether it's photography, museums. This is a huge sector. It's a financial sector and it is an intellectual sector. And that's where the JLF makes a huge contribution. That's why I never miss an invitation to speak at the JLF, although I'm not invited that often.
Let's not go down that route. But Homi, truly, we all know that art matters, and we know that artists, still get short shrift, and we know the impact that art can have on social life, on the world, etc. But my colleagues have asked me to start questions. But just before that, two things that you talked about earlier, which I want to just touch upon: environment, natural disasters. We know, for example, there's global warming. The effects of that, the scientists have been screaming from the rooftops for the last 4 decades. There's been enough scientific information that's come out, and yet governments across the world don't seem to agree on basic principles of getting a document out or signing up on a treaty and agreeing to basic deliverables. So that's one issue, knowing that the kind of impact that climate change will have, especially on low-lying places. See what happened in Venice recently. Look at Amsterdam. Look at Norway, where a whole hill slid into the fjord. So that's one. On the second hand, we also know that natural disasters will happen. We all know that California is said to be sitting on the St. Andreas Fault, which is one of the most unstable in the world. And yet you're building gigantomous cities around and along this fault, knowing fully well that the prediction and the films that have been made around it, that all of this will be lost to the oceans, will come to pass. Not today, not tomorrow, but maybe in the future. And yet, the immediacy of it, till it hits us, doesn't seem to be an issue.
I think we've come round back to where we started in a very positive way. I think you're absolutely right. I said initially that notion of risk, notion of fear, notion of anxiety, notion of unpreparedness is part of a certain temperament, is part of the human temperament. It's a way of taking difficult circumstances, even things and somehow building the good city, the big dream on top of them. That is a particular problem. But of course, when you talk about the building on the San Andreas fault, all these things. Well, that is exactly where property, the too big to fail idea comes. We governments are powerful enough. We leaders are extraordinarily powerful. And this is the great danger of democracy. We have taken the question of the unprepared, both as a spur to creativity and also as a constriction over citizens in this current moment. The great problem of democracy is the lack of educational instruments, cultural instruments, political institutions to keep the dialogue alive. The media is now captured in one way or another. Everything is seen in terms of party politics. And when it's seen in terms of party politics, as far as I'm concerned, the question is we all want to play the game, but we don't want the rules anymore. We don't want to know the rules and we don't want to set new rules. The most dangerous thing at the moment is that under the guise of perfectly legal democratic processes, we have leaders across the world and bodies of opinion across the world who are saying, who are reversing the values of democracy. It's authoritarianism within the vessel.
In the guise of democracy, Homi, and I'm going to go straight to a question which sort of addresses this. Ria asks, is it practical to assume that government stroke leaders would be prepared or would assume an onset of pandemic when regular administrative functions itself are barely managing? And the other one that I wanted to take as well is Rachita Akhilesh Chauhan asks, is the unpreparedness an expression of ego, as every new government tears down any work that the previous government has done just to shine in contrast?
So, the first question, the pandemic, which as I recall is about administrative structures not being able to deal with it. Yeah. I mean, here in the United States, you have a flagrant example of the Obama government providing a kind of rule book about the pandemic, having a unit for it, and the Trump government deciding that it was not going to go in that direction and disbanding it. So here you have the answer to the first question, that had there been a careful administrative, as there was, foresight, we would have been better prepared. And Trump vetoing it, the Trump government vetoing it, is clearly about egoism. But what I want to say is something related to both. I think we're in a situation where we go back to this problem of the undemocratic elements within a democratic institutional arrangement. And the problem here is that there will be now, post-Trump or post-other authoritarian governments in India, post-Modi, post-Bolsonaro, there is a group, I think now maybe 30%, maybe 27%, I don't know what, who have been completely taken by this new mode of movement politics, which is outside of the checks and balances of democratic politics, party politics, whether it's good or whether it's bad. These groups will move around. They will go from Sanders voters to becoming Trump voters, as we saw last time. But they see themselves outside of the party politics. This is a new movement politics. How this will be contained, how this will be organized, how this will evolve is very important. Contrary to that are the groups who were on the streets, throwing their own safety, health safety, to the winds, doing the best they could, but being on the streets together from all races, classes, generations. 75-year-old man in Seattle, 17-year-old girl in Washington, one Mexican, the other Latinx, the third one African-American, white. This is the counterbalance to that movement politics. And how these two groups will develop and who will be able to fire them with an organizational, administrative foresight is the issue that we have to ask ourselves about.
I'm going to have to end with this one last question. I'm sorry, everybody. I know you've sent in hundreds of questions, but I'd love to keep Homi here for at least another 2 years, and because I just enjoy his conversation and his mind, but we're not going to be able to do that. As Sachdev Ramakrishnan asks, Dr. Bhabha, on an optimistic note, does human history hopefully indicate a better world at the end of such catastrophic events, such as the pandemic now or other significant events before? And can we end up as a more caring civic society?
Well, my dear friend, that is a wonderful note on which to end. And I think that I think human societies do learn from the unprepared conditions into which they are thrust. And they also learn from the governance of the unprepared by powerful, short-sighted, and I hope short-lived, undemocratic, more autocratic periods. Of course, we learn from these things. We learn from not only what we gain, but from what we lose. We learn from the negative. We learn from suffering. We learn from human fatality even. We learn from death, social death as well as physical death. The question is how much within a span of time that you are effective, that I'm effective, within a life of 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, what is the balance? What is the balance of grief, vulnerability, and exploitation and oppression? And what is the balance of flourishing, liberty, and freedom? These are things for which we are finally as individuals unprepared. But we have to contemplate on them, and we've got to find our ways of life between them. So I think there is, eventually, we will learn from this period that even if we could not see our neighbors, we would do things. For instance, my way of maintaining neighborliness at this time of the pandemic, when I couldn't see all my friends to eat with and drink with, whatever I cooked at home, I would cook extra and leave it on the doorstep of my various friends. That's the way in which we had virtually broke bread at the same bread without actually being able to see each other. Of course, that's a very small illustration, but I think the networks of caring, the networks of invention, even through social distancing, have taught us how intimacy and proximity is not simply a physical virtue or a value. It is the very fundamental necessity of living together with others.
Professor Bhabha, you've talked about the balance, which we all need to find. You've talked about learning from suffering, which we all, I think, learn every day. And the human resilience is so incredible. And we'd love to have you back to continue this conversation, not just on unpreparedness, but on the rights of the dead that you and I have talked about so often. And we're trying to create a movement around it. But thank you so much. Thank you for illuminating us today. And thank you all for watching Maina Bhagat. And so many of you have sent in questions. I'm truly sorry that I've hogged all the time and not given up so many of your questions. We thank our official radio partners, Red FM Bajate Raho. We hope you enjoyed this conversation, and we'll log back at 9 p.m. for our next session, an orchestra of minorities, Chigozie Obioma in conversation with Aruni Kashyap. Chigozie Obioma, the Nigerian writer described as the heir to Chinua Achebe, is the author of The Fisherman and an Orchestra of Minorities, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 2019. Told from the perspectives of the protagonist Chinonso's 700-year-old chi, or spirit in the Igbo tradition, the novel speaks of the mythologies as well as the realities of love. In conversation with writer and academic Aruni Kashyap, Obioma speaks of his books, telling us why he writes and for whom. And for now, we present a short extract from the archives of the Jaipur Morning Music Stage featuring Vidushi Saraswati Rajagopalan, an acclaimed veena player belonging to the Carnatic classical music genre. Hailing from a musical family, she started rendering solo performances from the age of 12. Enjoy the music. See you back at 9 p.m. Indian Standard Time.